Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, June 11th, 1986, a report is presented to President Ronald Reagan, and then there are a number of very high-profile hearings, and it's all the result of an investigation by a presidential commission into the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Challenger had exploded shortly after liftoff on January 28th, 1986. It killed all 7 people on board, and the launch, among many other things that made it notable, was the fact that it was broadcast live to school children in science classrooms around the country. And now, about 5 months later, a final report laid out the cascading problems that led to the disaster. Ultimately, the technical reason for the disaster came down to a faulty O-ring. Here is the language, if you're interested. I'm quoting here. A failure in the O-ring sealing the aft field joint on the right solid rocket booster, causing pressurized hot gases and eventually flame to blow by the O-ring and contact the adjacent external tank, causing structural failure. So that's the technical reason. But really, the report painted a picture of human failure and organizational failure, and a really interesting picture of how bureaucracy and poor management can lead to genuine tragedy. So let's talk about the Rogers Commission report, the Challenger disaster, and some of the larger lessons therein. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Do you have memories of this one? We're in that age.
Don't. I mean, I should have been old enough. I would have been 6 when this happened, but it's just, I don't know if we weren't watching it or if we were watching it and it just didn't make an impression. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, you know, at 6, as I was 4, there's no way I would have remembered it unless my parents had, you know, either showed me and reminded me or something. I know for a lot of children, though, who are much older, maybe 12, certainly middle schoolers, this was a transformative moment in their lives because there was so much excitement about seeing the liftoff and the launch of the Challenger, and everyone knew that there was a school teacher who was on board, and they were, you know, the first or second, I should say, African-American in space. Ronald McNair was on board, and so there was a lot of media frenzy around this launch. And for those old enough to remember, it really stuck with them.
Yeah, my sense is that it was one of those I remember where I was when moment for that generation.
Absolutely.
Because if you were just old enough, if you were old enough to remember with it, it just had a strong emotional impact.
Mm-hmm.
Kellie, were you telling us before we started taping that you were a McNair scholar? Is that right?
Yeah, I was a Ronald McNair scholar, which is a program that helps students get into graduate school. But when I think about Ronald McNair, he was 35 years old, which is just incredible. Got his PhD from MIT, had all of these accolades attached to him. Just brilliant person, but also well-rounded. Found out he was like a saxophonist and really into jazz. Like, it was more than just physics for him. He was an incredible person. So many were all of the others who were on board this Challenger. Huge loss of life and talent. And when you realize that this is a mistake that could have been prevented and a mistake that was sort of forewarned, it makes it all the more devastating.
So let's get into that. And actually, to sort of frame that, I was looking at the speech that Reagan gives. I think it's that night, the address to the nation, and it's that's just as seared into people's memories as anything, and in large part because of the final lines where he talks about the crew members prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Right. Earlier in that speech, though, he says, and I think he's talking to kids here, but he says, I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons, which I found really surprising to sort of do a defense of the scientific process in the midst of this tragedy. I mean, I'm kind of almost more moved by that than I am by those famous final lines.
It's kind of a Mr. Rogers moment in the middle of this, which is fascinating. Yeah,
well, Reagan had that gear for sure. But, that does sort of point out that, like, this is a process. There was some part of something went wrong here, but that's part of this. And I think part of the understanding what went wrong was this Rogers Commission. And so there were a number of hearings before the report is finally presented to Reagan. But generally speaking, what does the commission find is at fault? I know I read about the O-ring, but let's paint the picture of what the Rogers Commission ultimately concludes.
I mean, you could say that it was a failure of communication, that not everyone was communicating properly about the limitations and the faults of their equipment and of the technology. And so, when the scientists are speaking out about, hey, this is actually not perfected. Hey, we still need to work on this. And there are other people, politicals, who are pushing for this launch, who are pushing to get it out into space. You have this mishmash of motives and of purpose, and things really started to fall apart. You have a really grievous comment by this NASA contractor where he says, "I fought like hell to stop that launch. I'm so torn up inside. I can hardly talk about it even now." He said 6 months before the Challenger explosion happened, he predicted it. He predicted it would be a catastrophe of the highest order, and that it would involve the loss of human life.
And that's so striking, right? You have this kind of Cassandra figure here in the background saying, danger, danger, we have to fix this thing. And when you hear the description, so somebody we'll talk about in a minute, Richard Feynman, who was part of this commission, he was a theoretical physicist, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965. When he is talking about what happened, he actually describes it so clearly. That O-ring is a seal that's on the rocket. And when it goes through dramatic temperature changes, when it gets really hot and then really cold, which happens when you are leaving Earth's atmosphere and going into space after a fiery launch, the O-ring doesn't hold its shape. It stretches out, but it doesn't snap back right away, which means it's no longer doing its sealing function. That's like the thing that it's there to do, it can't do. And the scientists understood that this critical part of the rocket didn't work under the conditions that it was going to be under. And so when you say it's a failure of communication, you have the people over here saying, this ain't going to work, and the people over here saying 10, 9, 8. And so it's just, it gives it an air of real tragedy, not just for the loss of life, but because of how preventable it was.
Yes, the inability to persuade the powers that be that the time is not right, that we are not all systems go. Right. And where that disbelief comes from, where it's like, oh, it'll be fine, that hubris is what leads to all kinds of tragedies.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So, specifically on this case, the commission found that as early as 1977, 9 years, people had been pointing out that the O-ring was flawed and had a potential for catastrophe. And you mentioned Feynman, who's, I think, the most interesting character in all this. And also, frankly, I think one of the most interesting people, just period. Every time I encounter a video by him or a lecture by him or anything by him, I'm just like, wow, you are really remarkable. He's part of this blue ribbon panel that also includes former politicians. Neil Armstrong's on it, Sally Ride is on it, Chuck Yeager's on it, but it's a mix of, much like NASA, it's a mix of like scientists and bureaucrats, right? And he actually, one of the more sort of notable moments, you can go find this on YouTube, but he literally in the middle of one of the hearings, he takes out a glass of ice water, puts the O-ring in it, pulls it out, and shows how it gets distorted just by a temperature change. And he's like, this is what happened. One of the things I know about Richard Feynman is he's just really good at plain language explanation of complicated things, and that's him doing that. So yes, clearly people knew about this for a long time. There were people who afterwards said, I'd been raising the alarm. The managers weren't listening to the scientists who were identifying this. But I also think somewhere in here is the story that in a big, complicated, high-stakes organization like this, it's constant crisis management. And part of the job is to sort of make the call about something that might be a problem, but is it a critical problem? Where on the list of 50 things that we need to address does it go? You can't, everything can't be perfect at all times, I don't think. But somewhere in there is, what makes this all so very complicated. And the Commission's report is most interesting to me as a picture of a bureaucracy than it is a sort of explanation of a functional failure. And in the end, they conclude that this disaster was, quote, an accident rooted in history. And I think it's the history of an organization that has two camps, right? It has the scientific camp and the bureaucratic camp, and somehow over time, those don't actually communicate the critical things to each other. And I mean, we've all been in dysfunctional bureaucracies and can recognize how that
Can I
works.
just say, Jody, that you pointed out something to me that is what is so remarkable is when you do have success. Because when you think about how the incompatibility of the science community and sort of the bureaucratic community, the fact that they were able to accomplish things, the fact that they were able to land a man on the moon and launch satellites, shows you the potential of what can happen when everyone is working together on the same side. But there's so much more of an aptitude for failure and for catastrophe when you operate out of those two camps than there is for success. And so it just, again, still mind-blowing to me what people are able to do when there's proper communication.
This reminds me so much, even though they're very different things in some ways, of that memo bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. Like that the information is out there, but it is part of a lot of other information. It's hard to know, is it important? Have we heard these kinds of warnings before and we had success without heeding them? That kind of both a problem of communication, but also a problem of an information environment where it can be difficult to know what the important problems are and what they aren't. And just to sort of backstop what you were saying earlier, Jody, if there's something about that feels similar.
Right. So when the report gets issued, it offers both a story of how this disaster came to be, and then it offers conclusions. And the conclusion, largely speaking, is that this was a problem and this was a disaster, but NASA should take care of it. They can handle this internally. And Feynman is the one who stakes out this position and says, no, we need to shut it down. This is not something that can just be taken care of inside the very bureaucracy that was broken. And I think we see that so often these days, with places that have systemic problems. But then the conclusion is, well, they know themselves best, so they'll take care of it. And, often my reaction is, well, the place that screwed it up, it might not be the place to fix it. So.
Agreed. Listen, I always say listen to the scientists. Listen to the experts. Listen to the people who know. I mean, when there are lives at stake, I think we should all be a bit cautious. I think we should all want to slow down or take a pause. Since this has happened, scientists have made over 100 changes to the shuttle. So, from minor changes to major changes, the shuttle is much more safer and much more reliable. And I think safety is prioritized. Not to say that it wasn't before, but I think they check even more because of this. So in some sense, tragedies can lead to much more vigilance when you think about how people are going to be in approaching new technologies. But yeah, I'm always err on the side of caution. And I appreciate the people that, are extra rigorous.
Since for 22 years after this happened, NASA did not include civilians on its flights anymore, in part because of how dramatic the loss of life was here. Now we're in an age of civilian spaceflight and private spaceflight. And once you throw
crazy.
But once you throw in that profit motive, once you're worried about shareholders and stakeholders as well as politics and things like that, it does seem like the opportunities for catastrophe do go up significantly. I mean, who knows? It's still in its early days, but I do worry about the introduction of that profit motive
This
as
is
well.
why you will never see me on a spaceship. This is why I will be in no one's line to go to Mars, to go to the moon. You can miss me with all that. No thanks. I'm fine here on Earth. Like, I'm not interested. I can go to a roller coaster and get my kicks in, and that'll be good.
I mean, I'm a Trekkie, so I'm totally for it, but not until they get, those gravity environments and a replicator, because I want to eat well while I'm in space.
There you go. And I should point out that we have done one episode sort of along these lines. I mean, we did an episode, and people can go check out that episode if you want. It was from August. I think a couple years ago we did it in late August. But you'll find it. It's called Teacher in Space. That is the seeds of this idea that civilians can go off into space and take a ride. But let's leave it there. End of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Commission member Richard Feynman, after examining the O-ring, had a surprise.
Oh, I took the stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back. It stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least. There's no resilience in this particular material. I believe that has some significance.
Radiotopia.